Culture Minister and Deputy Nationals Leader Barnaby Joyce believes farmers won't be left worse off. I spoke to Mr Joyce a short time ago and asked why the Senate, which didn't agree to the tax rise, would agree to lift compensation for that tax rise.
If we're talking about the diesel fuel rebate, that's basically a clear statement that the people who don't use fuel on the road, fishermen at sea, I mean, how can you possibly charge them for a road charge? Farmers in a tractor, we're going to say to the farmer, look, we think you should be paying for a road charge. And people in mines, they say, well, our trucks work in the mine. They're not on your public road. If they do go on your public road, you have every entitlement to ask us for the money, but they're not on your public roads. And for people who are on the public roads, they're saying to us all the time, we want to increase the capacity, increase the standard of our roads, and we would love to do that just from the money we have in the bank, but the Labor Party blew all the money in the bank.
But is bypassing the Senate the way to buy a bit of goodwill?
I think it's really important that we do what's ever within our power to make sure that the aspirations and the requirements of the Australian people for better infrastructure such as roads are matched by our capacity to fund it. And if we don't do that, we're not being honest to ourselves and we just add to our debt. Our debt is now in excess of $350 billion, and that's because the Labor Party put us on this trajectory where in the next 10 years we're going to go to $667 billion, and the debt would keep on going on up after that. We can't do it.
But you knew there was a big debt at the time of the election, but there was a promise made for lower taxes. Does this decision to restart the indexation break that promise in spirit?
No, I think that it's this indexation was something that was put on pause. I think it's vitally important that if we don't turn around our nation's finances, then we go out the financial back door.
But you didn't promise it at the election, did you?
We have to make sure that we get the finances of our nation right. I think the Australian people clearly understand what is your number one priority. If we go out the financial back door, we can't afford hospitals. We don't have to worry about building roads. We have no money. We can't afford for all the other public infrastructure, such as the ABC. We can't afford SBS. We can't afford pensions. And the Australian people cannot afford for that to happen. So we must turn around the finances of our nation, because if we don't, it's the only place we could possibly be going. And if you doubt us, go to AOFM and look at how our overdraft is going, left to us, thank you, by Mr Swan and the previous Labor government.
Do you accept, though, that all this was known before the election? In fact, you campaigned very strongly on the issue of debt and deficit, yet some of the measures that have been chosen since the election to address them have breached the spirit of commitments, haven't they?
Well, I think that ultimately your number one objective is to return the nation to a balanced financial position. If you don't, then your next statement, it won't be a promise, it won't be a decision, it'll be forced on you, is they'll say, you don't have the money to build that new hospital, you don't have the money to staff that new hospital, you don't have the money to pay, to send to the states to pay for the doctors in that hospital, you don't have the money to pay for the pensions, you don't have any more money, Australia, you're out. And we don't want to get into that position. And it won't happen by a miracle. The fairy godmother of credit cards is not going to descend from heaven and say, I'm going to make it all better for you. We have to be responsible ourselves.
You've been at a meeting on water infrastructure. That's largely about dams, isn't it? When will decisions be made about what the government can build and how it will build them?
Well, I'm happy to say that we're already building our first one, and that's Capi Dam. I'm happy to say that's a large part of that money comes from the federal government, for which I had to find extra to make sure that that project got going. We already have allocated money in the last month to further piping and capping of the Great Artesian Basin, where the money would otherwise flow out over the paddocks and 97% of it would evaporate. We're already started on Wallace Lakes, we're already started on works at the Menindee storage lakes. So we're already started in this program. But what today was essential for was getting a wide group of people, which shows the interest that the Australian people have in constructing new dams, into a room and saying, well, the super funds, you have the money, the construction companies can build the dams. What is the role of government? To what extent is that role of government? How do we make the way clear so we're not held up by invertebrates and amphibians and molluscs and a whole range of other basically impediments to constructing the next stage of Australia's economic development? Because we need to do this to secure our soft commodity channel into Asia. We can't export food if we can't secure the production of that food.
Is though your preference to where you can get the private sector to build the dams and for the government to come in and maybe fill in the gaps?
Yeah, well, yeah, my preference obviously is to spend as little money as possible for the best possible return. It's making sure that all that process is in place, because I strongly believe that the vision that was held by Curtin, by Chifley, by Menzies when they constructed the Snowy Mountain scheme, that they're not the best, that we have people as good at being visionary as they were, and that our nation has a higher place to go, and that we will not, for the rest of our time, just always be saying, oh, our glory days when we actually could construct something, our glory days when we did build the Snowy Mountain scheme, but unfortunately the impetus, the intellect, the expertise, we're bereft of it now. It is all over and finished. No, I believe it's still there, and we as a nation have to make that statement and step forward. I note the Greens will never be happy. They will say, no matter what, that civilisation is a curse, and therefore that we have to somehow resolve ourselves to living without water and ultimately living without food, and however in that sort of magical wonderland that they live in. I know that they will be my adversary, but I'm prepared for that.
Barnaby Joyce, thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure.